The fire started before dawn. It moved through the cedar beams of the inner sanctuary first, wood imported from Lebanon 5 centuries earlier, hauled across mountains and deserts to build something the people of Judah believed would stand forever. Then the flames reached the gold. The walls of the inner chamber were lined with it. The heat turned it liquid, and it ran down through the cracked stone and into the earth below. The 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, verse 586 years before the Common Era. The Temple of Solomon, the physical dwelling place of God on earth, the center of an entire civilization's identity, was burning. Outside the walls, the city was being taken apart, not looted, dismantled, systematically, methodically, stone by stone, as if the Babylonians understood that a ruin can become a shrine, but rubble becomes nothing. The population that had survived 30 months of siege, starved, diseased, hollowed, was being chained and organized into columns for the march east. Among them, priests who had served a temple that no longer existed, scribes whose entire world had just been reduced to ash, nobles whose families had lived in Jerusalem for generations, now property of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And somewhere on the road to Riblah, a blinded king was being led in bronze chains toward a city he would never leave. Nebuchadnezzar II had done exactly what he set out to do. He had destroyed a kingdom, erased a capital, and deported its people. It was the standard imperial playbook, and it had worked on every people the ancient world had thrown at it. Give it 2 or 3 generations, and the deportees would dissolve, their language absorbed, their gods forgotten, their identity gone. He was wrong. And the story of why he was wrong is the most consequential accident in religious history. By the 7th century before the Common Era, the kingdom of Judah was already living on borrowed time. It was not the first Israelite kingdom to face the empires rising from the east. It was the survivor of a catastrophe that had already consumed its sibling. The northern kingdom of Israel had been the larger of the two, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Samaria as its capital, a kingdom with resources, armies, and alliances. In 720 BC, the Assyrian Empire under Sargon II erased it. The 10 northern tribes were deported across the Assyrian Empire, resettled in foreign lands, scattered among populations they had nothing in common with. Within 2 generations, they were gone, not killed, absorbed. Their language replaced. Their religion dissolved into the gods of wherever they had been sent. History swallowed them whole. They are called the Lost Tribes of Israel, and they were lost because conquest, displacement, and time did exactly what they always do to a people without the tools to resist them. Judah survived by bending, by paying tribute to Assyria, by keeping its head down through decades of imperial domination. Jerusalem stayed standing, the temple stayed intact, the priesthood continued functioning. The religion survived because its physical infrastructure survived. That was the deal, submission in exchange for continuation. But Assyria was dying, and from the east, something new was rising. The Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II was not interested in tribute. Tribute meant a relationship, and a relationship meant a subject people retained a degree of identity and self-governance. Nebuchadnezzar was engineering something more permanent. He wanted a Babylonian empire, not a collection of vassal kingdoms, each preserving its own culture on the margins. And he understood something that lesser conquerors missed. The most dangerous element of any conquered people is not its army, it is its thinkers. In 597 BC, after Judah's king Jehoiakim refused to continue payments, Nebuchadnezzar moved. He besieged Jerusalem and took it without destroying it. That restraint was calculated. He deported the king, the royal family, the court, the nobility, the priesthood, the military leadership, approximately 7,000 people. The finest minds and the most capable organizers in the entire kingdom, gone to Babylon. He then installed a puppet king named Zedekiah, left the temple standing, left the city functioning, and returned to Babylon. It was a masterstroke. A leaderless Judah, stripped of everyone capable of mounting organized resistance, was cheaper and easier to control than a destroyed one. Nebuchadnezzar had performed surgery, removing the brain and leaving the body intact, just useful enough to generate resources for the empire, just hollow enough to never threaten it. He should have left it there. Zedekiah was not the man for the impossible position he had been placed in. He was a puppet who wanted to be a king. He was surrounded by advisors who fed him the one fantasy that desperate men in impossible positions always reach for, that help was coming. Egypt, the old power to the south, was stirring. Egyptian armies were on the move. If Judah rose now, if Zedekiah broke with Babylon and declared independence, Egypt would arrive in force and tip the balance. In 589 BC, Zedekiah rebelled. Egypt did send an army. Nebuchadnezzar defeated it and turned back toward Jerusalem without breaking stride. There is something in that detail, the sheer mechanical efficiency of it, that tells you everything about the kind of force Judah was dealing with. An Egyptian army, the kind of military intervention that smaller kingdoms built their entire strategic calculus around, was not even a serious interruption to Babylon's schedule. In January of 589 BC, the Babylonian army arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem and did not leave for 30 months. What they built around the city was not just a military encampment, it was a wall, a siege wall encircling the entire city designed to create a perfect seal. Nothing in, nothing out, no food convoys, no messengers, no possibility of escape. The population of Jerusalem, soldiers, priests, artisans, children, was locked inside with whatever they had when the wall went up. 30 months is 912 days. The ancient accounts that survive from this period describe what happens to a city after enough of those days pass. The grain runs out first, then the stores, then the animals. By the second year, the accounts record that famine had reached a severity that broke every social and moral boundary. Children were dying in the streets. The city's water supply was compromised. Disease moved through populations already weakened by hunger in the way that disease always moves through such populations, efficiently and without mercy. The walls of Jerusalem held for 2.5 years. The people inside were not holding, they were dying by degrees. In the summer of 586 BC, the Babylonians breached the wall. The exact location where they broke through has been disputed by archaeologists for generations. What is not disputed is what happened next. Zedekiah ran. He gathered whatever remained of his personal guard and slipped out through a gap in the city's defenses under cover of darkness, heading south toward the Jordan Valley. He made it as far as the plains of Jericho, roughly 35 kilometers from Jerusalem, before Babylonian cavalry caught him. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at the city of Riblah in what is now northern Syria. The king of the most powerful empire on earth sat in judgment of the man who had been his puppet and had chosen to betray him. The sentence Nebuchadnezzar delivered was not random cruelty, it was designed. Zedekiah's sons were brought forward and executed in front of their father, one by one, in sequence, until they were all gone. And then, in the last act of a specifically calibrated punishment, Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out. The last thing Zedekiah ever saw was the death of his children. He was then bound in bronze chains and marched east to spend the remainder of his life in Babylonian captivity. He never saw Jerusalem again, though by the time he left it, there was almost nothing left to see. The destruction of Jerusalem was not a sacking. A sacking is opportunistic. This was professional. The Babylonian forces spent the weeks following the breach systematically dismantling everything that could be dismantled and burning everything that remained. The Temple of Solomon, 500 years old, built by the king whose name it bore with cedar from Lebanon and gold from across the ancient world, was stripped before it was destroyed. Every gold and bronze object was catalogued and carried out. The 7-branched menorah, the altar, the table of showbread, the great bronze basin called the sea, the 2 massive pillars that stood at the temple's entrance, Jachin and Boaz, were broken apart with tools and loaded onto carts for Babylon. Then the building was set on fire. It burned on the 9th day of the month of Av. That date would not be forgotten. The city walls, the walls that had held a Babylonian siege army at bay for 30 months, were torn down stone by stone. The royal palace was burned. Every significant structure in Jerusalem was systematically destroyed. When the Babylonians finished, they surveyed what remained and made a final calculation. They left behind only the very poorest of the agricultural population, people without education, without connections, without any capacity to organize or remember. To these people they gave the abandoned vineyards and fields of everyone they had taken. It was a final act of administrative efficiency. The land would still produce, and the people left to work, it posed no threat to anyone. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. In its place, a Babylonian province called Yehud, administered by Babylonian officials, paying taxes to Babylon, on no map under any name, the people who had lived there would have recognized. The people who mattered, by which Nebuchadnezzar meant the people capable of mattering, were in Babylon. To understand what Babylon meant to a people arriving from a destroyed city, you have to understand what Babylon was. In the 6th century before the Common Era, Babylon was the largest city on earth. Its walls were so broad that the ancient accounts describe chariot races being held on top of them. The city was laid out in a precise grid, bisected by the Euphrates, filled with temples and palaces and markets of a scale that would have been incomprehensible to someone arriving from the modest streets of Jerusalem. The Ishtar Gate, the northern entrance to the city, reconstructed today in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, was a towering structure faced with deep blue glazed tiles, carved with rows of lions, bulls, and dragons in alternating registers, the whole thing gleaming in the Mesopotamian sun like something from a dream of power. The Jewish exiles were settled along the agricultural canals of the Babylonian countryside. They were not slaves in the Roman sense of that word. They were deportees, resettled by imperial policy, expected to integrate into Babylonian economic life and, in time, to become Babylonian. Other conquered peoples had taken this path. The Assyrians had mastered the technique: move people far enough from home, give them land and economic participation, let 2 generations pass, and the old identity dissolves like salt in water. The 10 northern tribes were the proof of concept. They had been gone for over a century when the Judeans arrived in Babylon, absorbed without remainder into the Assyrian Empire. No community claiming descent from them, no preserved language, no surviving religious institution. Gone in the truest sense of the word. Babylon had every historical precedent to expect the same result from Judah. Give it until the grandchildren, and these people weeping by the canals would be Babylonians. The Judean exiles were weeping. A psalm composed during this period carries the image down through the centuries with the precision of a wound. By the rivers of Babylon they sat down and wept when they remembered Zion. It is one of the most human lines in the entire biblical canon. Not defiance, not prophecy, just grief, sitting beside a canal in a foreign empire, remembering a city that no longer exists. But grief was not all that was happening. What the Judean exiles did in the decades following the destruction of Jerusalem has no real parallel in the ancient world. Faced with the complete destruction of the physical infrastructure their religion required to function, no temple, no priesthood performing sacrifices, no Ark of the Covenant, no altar, no land, they did not abandon the religion. They rebuilt it from the inside, and what they built was something the ancient world had never seen, a religion that required none of those things. The synagogue was invented in Babylon. The word in Greek means to bring together, to assemble. Without a temple, without a functioning priesthood, the exiles needed a mechanism for community and continuity. The synagogue was the answer, a gathering space for prayer, for reading, for study, for maintaining collective identity. It required no ordained priest. It required no specific building, no sacred location, no special architecture. It required 10 Jewish adults willing to assemble. That was the entire specification. This was not a small innovation. This was the most portable religious institution in human history. A synagogue could be constituted in a Babylonian city, a Persian village, an Egyptian port, a Roman province, a medieval ghetto, a displaced persons camp in post-war Europe. Wherever 10 Jewish adults found themselves, the institution could exist. It was born from catastrophe, and it was designed, consciously or not, to be indestructible by the means that it destroyed everything else. Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was compiled, redacted, and established as canonical during the Babylonian exile. Historical and textual scholars broadly agree that the exile period was when the foundational documents of Judaism were assembled into their authoritative written form, systematically organized, and placed at the center of Jewish religious practice. The reasons are not mysterious. When you cannot perform sacrifice, you read about sacrifice. When you cannot make pilgrimage to the temple, you study the texts that describe it. The text itself becomes the homeland. A book is a territory that no army can occupy and no fire can permanently destroy, because a book can be copied. The rabbi emerged from this same crucible. Before the exile, Jewish religious authority was entirely hereditary. It belonged to the priesthood, a specific family lineage whose power was inseparable from the temple's existence. When the temple burned, the priests were still priests by bloodline, but their function had been destroyed along with the building it depended on. Into that vacuum came a new kind of authority, the scholar, the sage, the man whose standing derived not from who his father was, but from what he knew. Rabbinic authority lives in the mind. It travels with the person. No siege wall can contain it. No empire can confiscate it. No fire reaches it. The philosopher Yehezkel Kaufman, one of the 20th century's greatest scholars of Israelite religion, captured the transformation in a single sentence: the exile is the watershed. With the exile, the religion of Israel comes to an end, and Judaism begins. The scale of what was built in Babylon becomes even more extraordinary when you consider one specific institution. Ezekiel, the prophet who ministered to the exiles and whose visions of a future temple sustained them through the darkest years, established a Torah academy in the Babylonian town of Sura during the exile. That academy ran continuously for over 1,600 years, until 1001 of the Common Era. Oxford University, the oldest continuously operating educational institution in the Western world, is approximately 900 years old. A Jewish academy established by an exile in a conquered land outlasted it by 7 centuries. This is what was being built in Babylon, not survival, a civilization. In 539 BC, 47 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the world changed again. Cyrus the Great of Persia was not a conqueror in the Babylonian mode. He was something the ancient world had very rarely seen, an emperor with a theory of legitimacy that did not depend on destruction. When his forces met the Babylonian army at the Battle of Opis, they defeated them decisively. The city of Babylon, the greatest city on earth, surrendered without a siege. Cyrus entered through the gates in October of 539 BC to crowds that, by several ancient accounts, welcomed him. One of Cyrus's first acts was the decree that would become known as the Edict of Cyrus. It was a policy declaration allowing all deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscription discovered in the 19th century and now housed in the British Museum, records the policy in Cyrus's own words, or at least in the words his scribes cut into clay in his name. For the Jewish exiles, it was the moment the Psalms had been written toward. The Hebrew Bible's response to Cyrus is unlike anything else in the entire text. Isaiah calls him the Messiah, the Anointed One, the instrument of God's purpose. He is the only non-Jewish ruler in the entirety of the Hebrew scriptural canon ever given that title, a Persian king, a polytheist, the man who conquered Babylon and set the exiles free, elevated to a place in Jewish scripture that no Israelite king had ever occupied. Then, something unexpected happened. When the edict was issued and the road home was open, the Jewish exiles did not go home, not most of them. They had been in Babylon for nearly 50 years. They had built businesses along the canals, established academies, created community institutions, married, buried their dead in Babylonian soil, raised children who had never seen Jerusalem. The community that had wept by the rivers of Babylon had put down roots in those banks. Going home meant leaving behind everything they had built in the place they had been taken to against their will, and the land they would be going back to was not the land their parents had left. It was a depopulated Babylonian province. A minority chose to return, led by a man named Zerubbabel, who was of the Davidic royal line. They were idealists, believers, people for whom the land was not negotiable. They went back and they rebuilt. The second temple was completed in 516 BC, 70 years after the first temple burned, as if the prophets had measured the exile in advance and the numbers had come out exactly right. Later waves of return, led by Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the governor, would reinforce and restructure the restored community over the following century. But the majority of the Babylonian Jewish community stayed. This was the first permanent diaspora in Jewish history, not exile, not deportation, but choice. A community that had been taken from its land by force had decided, when given the freedom to return, to remain outside that land while keeping every element of its identity intact. That community would endure in the territory of ancient Babylon, present-day Iraq, for 2,500 years, until the 20th century of the Common Era. Those who did return brought Babylon with them. The synagogue, the Torah as written canonical text, the rabbi as the central authority of religious life. None of these things had existed in Jerusalem before the exile. All of them came back transformed into the permanent architecture of a transformed religion. Nebuchadnezzar had sent a temple-based religion into exile. What came back was something that no longer needed a temple. The date stayed. The 9th of Av, the day the first temple burned, was observed as a fast day in Jewish communities across the ancient world. It was a wound kept open deliberately, a calendar insistence that this had happened and would not be forgotten. Centuries passed. The second temple rose on the ruins of the first. Judea came under Persian rule, then Greek rule, then the brief sovereignty of the Maccabees, then Roman rule. The second temple was expanded under Herod the Great into something more magnificent than anything Solomon had built. A platform of white stone visible from miles away, a structure that Roman visitors described with awe. In 70 of the Common Era, Rome destroyed it. The second temple burned on the 9th of Av. The precision of that coincidence, the same date, separated by 516 years, lodged itself into Jewish consciousness as something beyond coincidence. Jewish theology has never resolved it into simple explanation, and perhaps that is the point. What it does is close a bracket. The first destruction and the second destruction, marked by the same date on the same calendar, become a single event in the architecture of Jewish historical memory. But this time, the tools were ready. The synagogue was already everywhere. The rabbi was already the central institution of community life. The Torah was already the portable homeland. When the second temple burned and the Roman exile scattered Jewish communities across 3 continents, those communities did not dissolve. They reassembled around the same 3 things that had been built in Babylon. Every time the Crusades tore through Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096, those communities had synagogues, they had rabbis, they had texts, they were destroyed and reassembled. The Spanish expulsion of 1492 scattered the Sephardic Jewish world across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Americas. The exiles took their synagogues with them, meaning they took their communities with them. And within a generation, the Spanish Jewish diaspora had rebuilt itself in Istanbul, Salonika, Amsterdam, and a dozen other cities. The Holocaust attempted the systematic extermination of every Jewish person in Europe. The communities that survived, and the state that was built in the aftermath, organized themselves around the same institutions that had been engineered in Babylon 2,500 years before. Every catastrophe after Babylon was survived with the tools built in Babylon. Every time a Jewish community was destroyed, it reassembled around the synagogue, the rabbi, and the text. Not because anyone consciously chose those particular tools in moments of crisis, but because those tools had been so completely woven into the fabric of Jewish life that they survived automatically, the way a language survives in the mouths of people who have been stripped of everything else. Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BC, 24 years after destroying Jerusalem. The Neo-Babylonian Empire he had built, the empire that constructed the Ishtar Gate and the Hanging Gardens and the siege walls that starved an entire city into submission, collapsed completely within 23 years of his death. It did not transform into something else. It did not survive as a provincial power. It ended. Persia absorbed it, and within a century, the culture, the language, and the imperial identity of Neo-Babylonian civilization had been buried under the weight of successive empires, each of which treated the previous one as raw material. The Ishtar Gate survives because German archaeologists excavated it in the early 20th century and shipped it piece by piece to Berlin, where it stands reassembled in a museum. Without that intervention, it would be rubble. The Hanging Gardens are gone, possibly never existed as described, or existed and left no trace recoverable by archaeology. The walls wide enough for chariot races are sand. The empire that built them is a chapter in a history book. This is the irony at the center of everything. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do to Judah what the Assyrians had done to the 10 northern tribes. He wanted to make a people disappear, not through genocide, which was expensive and inefficient, but through the method history had proven most reliably effective: destroy the physical infrastructure of their identity, move them far from home, give them economic integration, and let time do the rest. It was a sound strategy. It had a perfect track record. He chose the wrong people at the wrong moment. The elite he deported to Babylon, the priests, the scribes, the nobles, the scholars, were precisely the people capable of understanding what had happened to them and engineering a response. The 10 northern tribes had been farmers and craftsmen and soldiers, people whose identity was embedded in land and practice and temple. When those things were taken away, the identity had nothing left to attach to. The Judean exiles were different. They were thinkers, they were writers, and they were sitting in the greatest city on earth, with access to Babylonian learning, Babylonian libraries, and the enforced clarity of catastrophe. The destruction of Jerusalem did not end Judaism, it created it. The religion that entered Babylon was a temple religion, geographically specific, institutionally fragile, entirely dependent on a building that could be burned and a priesthood that could be deported. The religion that emerged from Babylon was something else entirely. It was portable, it was democratic, it was text-based, it was held in the minds of its people rather than the stones of its buildings. Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple and built the synagogue. He deported the priests and created the rabbi. He destroyed a kingdom and forged an identity so complete and so self-sufficient that the next 2,500 years of history, every empire, every expulsion, every attempt at extermination, could not touch it. He did not destroy Judaism. He made it indestructible.